The eclipse of mind. Peter always felt like the world around him was off. Not in an obvious way, nothing anyone else could see, but in the small details, the ones that made him feel like the universe was testing him. Like the way streetlights flickered when he walked past. Like the way conversations changed when he focused too hard. Like the way people sometimes hesitated, just for a moment, before speaking to him, like they weren't sure what they were about to say. He ignored it. For years. Until the day he couldn't. It started with a thought. A stupid, passing thought. Peter had been sitting on the train, staring out at the city skyline. The sun was setting behind the buildings, bathing the streets in warm, orange light. But his mind wandered. What if the sun never came back up? Just a fleeting idea. A weird little daydream. The train passed through a tunnel. Darkness swallowed the world for a few seconds. Then, it didn't leave. The train came out on the other side. But the city was wrong. The sky was still dark. The sun gone. Not set. Not hidden behind clouds. Just not there anymore. Peter's stomach lurched. The streetlights had already come on, casting an unnatural glow over the roads. People still walked the sidewalks. Cars still moved. The world continued like nothing had changed. But the sky was black. Peter's breath came sharp and shallow. No one else seemed to notice. A man on the train yawned. A woman scrolled through her phone. Business as usual. Peter stared. What had he just done? He got off at his stop. The street smelled different. The air felt thicker. The neon signs flickered, their colors shifting, melting into shades he had never seen before. The people, they moved differently. Like puppets with strings just slightly out of sync. The city had changed. And no one realized it but him. Peter's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He needed to focus. He needed to fix this. Think of the sun. Think of the sky. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing it to come back. Come back. He opened them. And everything was worse. The street was empty now. The buildings stretched too high, too thin, leaning toward him like they were listening. The pavement shifted beneath his feet, like he was standing on something alive. His own breath echoed, but nothing else made a sound. No cars. No people. Just waiting. The city was waiting. And Peter understood. It was his mind. His thoughts were changing the world. And every time he tried to fix it, it broke further. The streetlights buzzed. The air hummed. And in the distance, in the shadows between the buildings, something moved. Something big. Something that hadn't been here before. Peter's thoughts created it. And now it was coming for him. To be continued. The Eclipse of Mind, Part 2. Peter stood frozen in the silent city. The streets empty. The sky, black. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs. He had done this. His mind had done this. And now something was coming. It started as a shadow. Far down the street, between the distorted buildings. Something tall. Something wrong. It moved slowly, not walking, but shifting like it was being pulled toward him. Peter's breath hitched. His mind screamed at him to think, fix it, undo it. Think of light. Think of people. He closed his eyes, his hands clenching into fists. Bright lights. Crowds. The city as it was. He forced the thought into reality, willed it with every fiber of his being. And when he opened his eyes, the city was full. People filled the sidewalks, cars honked, music played from a street performer nearby. For a split second, Peter exhaled, relief washing over him like a wave. Until he noticed. They weren't moving. The people, the cars. Everything was still. Frozen mid-step, their faces locked in expressions of forced joy. Smiling, too wide, too unnatural. Like dolls waiting to be played with. Peter's stomach twisted. He turned in a slow circle. The shadow was still there. Closer now. The frozen people didn't react. Didn't run. Didn't blink. They weren't real. His mind hadn't brought them back. It had created something else. A mockery of what the world had been. The air buzzed, like the city was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the next mistake. Peter ran. His legs burned as he sprinted down the street, past the frozen crowd, their glassy eyes following him without moving their heads. He didn't stop, didn't look back. Not even when he heard the dragging footsteps behind him. Not even when he heard the whispers. Low, deep. "You are not in control." The voice sent ice through his veins. It wasn't inside his head. It was real. The thing behind him, it was real. His mind had created it, and now it wasn't his anymore. Peter turned a corner and slammed into something solid. A wall, but not a building, not concrete. Something black, shifting, moving. A barrier. The city had sealed him in. His own thoughts had trapped him. His breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. The street behind him darkened. Something huge rose from the shadows. Its form wasn't clear, not fully, like 1,000 shifting bodies trying to become one. But its face, it had his face. A stretched, warped version of him, grinning, mocking, and when it spoke, it was his own voice. "There is no waking up!" Peter screamed, and the world collapsed. To be continued. The Eclipse of Mind, Part 3. The End of Reality. Peter fell. Not onto the pavement. Not onto anything solid. Just into darkness. An endless void, weightless and suffocating at the same time. His own face stared down at him from above, twisted and grinning, stretching across the sky like a god watching over his creation. The city rippled. The buildings melted. And then, the screams began. The people, the frozen ones, the copies, the illusions, they were waking up. Not as people. Not as anything human. Their movements were jerky, unnatural. They blinked in unison. Their mouths opened too wide. They screamed. A collective, deafening wail that ripped through reality itself. The streets cracked beneath them. Light poles bent and twisted like they were being pulled by invisible hands. And above it all, Peter's own voice echoed. "You are not in control." The city shattered. Buildings collapsed in on themselves. People disintegrated into black ash, their bodies ripping apart at the seams. They weren't supposed to exist. And now, they didn't. Peter hit the ground. His body snapped back into reality like a rubber band pulled too tight. The city was burning. Or no, not burning. Dying. Streetlights flickered wildly, casting shadows that moved on their own. The air was thick with the smell of charred flesh and something worse. The sky still black. No stars. No moon. Just empty. Peter stood on shaking legs, his stomach lurching. The roads were cracked, splitting open like wounds. Bodies littered the sidewalks. Thousands. Most of them unrecognizable. Twisted limbs. Half-formed faces. Eyes melted into their skulls, like unfinished thoughts. The 70% who hadn't survived. The ones his mind couldn't sustain. The ones who had simply ceased to be. Peter staggered backward, his breath ragged. No! No, no, no! He had done this. He had thought it into existence. And now, there was no undoing it. The survivors found him. The 30% who remained. The ones who had been too strong to disappear. Or maybe, the ones his mind had decided to keep. Their eyes were different now. Hollow. Distant. They didn't look at him with relief. They looked at him with rage. With hatred. They knew. They knew what he had done. And they weren't afraid anymore. They were going to make him pay. The first hit came from behind. Something heavy, a pipe, a bat, a piece of the world he had broken. It smashed into his ribs, sending him to the ground. Another hit. A boot to his stomach. Another. Another. They swarmed him. Hands grabbed his arms, his legs, dragging him down the broken street. His vision blurred, blood pooling in his mouth. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. He already knew what they were going to do. Where they were going to put him. The place he had created. The place he had trapped himself in. The basement. A door slammed shut above him. Locks clicked. Chains rattled. The survivors had left him there. Left him in the dark. He stumbled forward, hands outstretched, but there was nothing. Just endless, choking blackness. The world outside was gone. The city was no longer his. But this place, this was his prison. A basement with no walls, no exits. Just an infinite void. And then, the whisper. Right behind him, his own voice. You never had control. Peter's scream never ended. Because time didn't exist here anymore. And he was going to rot in the dark forever.